The rain fell in steady sheets, drumming against the pavement and turning the city into a blur of grey and shimmering lights. Eva pulled her thin coat tighter around her shoulders as she wiped down the counter of the small cafe where she worked. It was late, and the usual rush of evening customers had dwindled to just a few stragglers. The warm glow of the cafe lights cast soft reflections on the fogged-up window beside her. She let out a breath, feeling the weight of another long day settle into her bones. She glanced at the clock. Just 10 more minutes until her shift ended. Then she could go home to the tiny apartment she shared with her 12-year-old brother, Ben. Another night of reheated leftovers and exhaustion, but at least she had him. He was the only family she had left. Just as she turned to grab her bag, a sudden commotion outside caught her attention. Through the rain-streaked glass, she saw people walking briskly, heads down, umbrellas tilted against the wind. Then amidst the hurried movements, a man staggered forward. His steps were unsteady, his suit drenched from the rain. For a moment he wobbled, as if trying to regain control. Then he collapsed. Eva's heart jumped. For a second she waited, expecting someone, anyone, to stop and help. But people walked past him, some sparing him a glance, others pretending not to see. She didn't think, she simply moved. Grabbing her coat, she dashed outside, the cold rain instantly soaking through her clothes. She knelt beside the man, shaking, his shoulder. Hey, can you hear me?" No response. His breathing was shallow, his face pale. Eva glanced around, hoping for help. No one. Just the endless blur of the city moving on, as if nothing had happened. Gritting her teeth, she hooked her arms under his shoulders, struggling to lift him. "Come on," she muttered. He was heavier than he looked, and Eva wasn't exactly strong. But she had spent her life pushing through exhaustion. This was no different. With all the strength she could muster, she managed to half carry, half drag him toward the street. A taxi slowed down at the sight, its driver hesitating before finally rolling down the window. "Help me get him inside," Eva pleaded. The driver sighed but got out, helping her ease the unconscious man into the back seat. "Hospital?" the driver asked, his voice gruff. Eva nodded. "Yes, please, hurry." She climbed in beside the man, pressing her hand against his forehead. He was clammy. Was it exhaustion? Low blood sugar? She had no idea. All she knew was that he needed help. The taxi weaved through the rain-slicked streets, and within minutes they arrived at the emergency entrance of the hospital. Nurses rushed out as soon as they saw them, placing the man onto a stretcher and wheeling him inside. Eva followed, dripping wet, her heart still racing. She didn't even know his name. A nurse turned to her. "Are you family?" Eva shook her head. "No, I found him like that. He collapsed." The nurse nodded. "We'll take it from here." She hesitated. Should she leave? Her shift was over. Ben would be waiting at home. But something in her wouldn't let her walk away. So she stayed. An hour passed, then another. She sat in the uncomfortable hospital chair, arms wrapped around herself as she listened to the soft beeping of monitors and the occasional murmur of doctors passing by. Finally, she saw movement. The man stirred, his fingers twitching against the stark white hospital sheets. His eyes fluttered open, blinking against the harsh fluorescent light. Eva stood up cautiously, his gaze slowly focused on her. Confusion flickered across his features. "Where?" His voice was rough, barely above a whisper. "You collapsed," Eva said gently. "You're in the hospital." His brows furrowed, and then, as if realization struck, he exhaled sharply. "Right." He tried to sit up but winced. "Easy," she warned, stepping closer. "You were completely out of it." He turned his head to fully look at her, studying her with tired but curious eyes. "You brought me here?" Eva nodded. For a moment he didn't say anything. Then his lips curved into something faintly resembling a smile. "That's unexpected." Eva raised an eyebrow. "Is it?" His expression softened. "Yeah, no one usually stops." She shrugged, uncomfortable under his gaze. "Well, I couldn't just leave you there." He let out a soft chuckle, though. It was clear he was still weak. "Guess I owe you one, then." "You don't owe me anything," she said quickly. "Just take care of yourself." He looked at her for a long moment before nodding. "What's your name?" "Eva," she replied. "Eva Williams." His tired smile widened slightly. "Ethan Montgomery." Eva offered a small smile in return before glancing at the clock. It was late. Ben was probably worried by now. "I should go," she said, stepping back. Ethan watched her, something unreadable in his expression. "Thank you, Eva." She hesitated just for a moment before nodding and walking toward the door. As she stepped back into the rainy night, she told herself that was the end of it. Just a stranger she had helped, but something told her that wasn't true. Something told her this was only the beginning. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp pavement from last night's rain. Eva pulled her coat tighter around her as she stepped out of her apartment building, already running late for work. She had barely gotten any sleep after coming home from the hospital. Ben had been worried sick when she arrived, and she had spent half the night reassuring him that she was fine. She wasn't sure why she had stayed at the hospital so long. It wasn't like she knew Ethan Montgomery. He was just a stranger she had found on the street. A stranger she had saved. And yet she couldn't shake the memory of his tired smile, the way his voice had softened when he thanked her. Pushing the thought aside, she hurried down the busy city street toward the café. Eva had just finished taking a customer's order when she heard the bell above the door chime. She turned instinctively and her breath caught. Ethan Montgomery stood just inside the cafe, his tall frame slightly stiff, as if he was still recovering. He looked much better than he had the night before, more color in his face, his dark hair neatly styled, his tailored coat hanging off his shoulders with casual elegance. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. They were searching for her. For a second, Eva froze. Then she quickly turned back to the register, focusing on the next customer. A moment later, a shadow fell over the counter. "Eva." His voice was smooth, yet hesitant. She glanced up, meeting his gaze. "Ethan." His lips twitched into a small smile. "I was hoping I'd find you here." She raised an eyebrow. "How did you even know where I worked?" He chuckled. "The nurse at the hospital told me. Said you mentioned rushing off to a shift at a cafe." He gestured around. "Didn't take long to find the right one." Eva crossed her arms. "So, you tracked me down?" Ethan held up his hands in mock surrender. "Not in a creepy way, I promise." She sighed, shaking her head. "What do you want, Ethan?" "To say thank you, properly," he said, his expression turning serious. "You saved my life. That's not something I can just ignore." "You don't owe me anything," she replied, waving him off. But Ethan didn't budge. "I disagree. Look, at least let me buy you dinner. It's the least I can do." She hesitated. The offer caught her off guard, and she wasn't used to people doing things for her. But before she could respond, her manager, Rosa, appeared behind her. "You should go," Rosa said, giving her a knowing look. "Your shift's almost over anyway." Eva shot her a glare, but Rosa just grinned and disappeared back into the kitchen. Ethan smirked. "Seems like your boss is on my side," she sighed. "Fine. One dinner. That's it." He placed a hand over his heart. "One dinner. I swear." Eva wasn't sure why she agreed. Maybe it was the way he looked at her, not like a rich man pitying a struggling waitress, but as if he truly wanted to know her, and that scared her more than she was willing to admit. The restaurant Ethan chose was fancier than anywhere Eva had ever been. Dim lighting, white tablecloths, waiters dressed better than most people she knew. She felt completely out of place. Ethan, on the other hand, seemed completely at ease, leaning back in his chair as if this was just another regular evening for him. "Are you always this stubborn?" he asked, amusement in his tone. Eva glanced up from her menu. "Excuse me," he smirked. "You wouldn't let me pay for the hospital bill. You tried to refuse this dinner. You act like letting someone do something nice for you is a crime." She shrugged, looking away. "I don't like owing people anything." Ethan's smile faded slightly. "Maybe sometimes it's not about owing. Maybe it's just about accepting kindness." She swallowed. That was a lesson life had never really taught her. "So," he said, changing the subject, "tell me about yourself." She let out a short laugh. "What do you want to know?" "Everything." She arched an eyebrow. "That's a lot for one. Dinner? Then we might need more than one dinner," he said, flashing her a playful smile. She shook her head, but something warm spread through her chest. And just like that, what was supposed to be a simple meal stretched into hours of conversation. She told him about Ben, about losing her parents, about struggling to keep a roof over their heads. And instead of pity, Ethan listened. Really listened. By the time the restaurant was closing, Eva realized something she hadn't expected. She liked talking to him, and maybe, just maybe, she wanted to see him again. Eva hadn't meant to let Ethan into her life. She had always been careful, guarded. Life had taught her not to rely on anyone but herself. People left, promises broke, and kindness often came with expectations she couldn't afford to meet. But Ethan, he kept showing up. At first, it was small things. He would drop by the cafe on his way to work, always ordering the same thing, a black coffee and whatever pastry Eva recommended that day. He never pushed, never asked for more than a few minutes of conversation. But the way he looked at her, that was harder to ignore. "You know, you don't have to keep coming here," she told him one afternoon, leaning against the counter as he took a sip of his coffee. He smirked. "What if I just really liked the coffee?" She gave him a skeptical look. "Uh-huh. Because a guy like you doesn't have a million other places to get coffee." Ethan shrugged. "True, but none of them have you." Her breath caught for a split second before she rolled her eyes, masking the warmth creeping up her neck. "That's the worst line I've ever heard." He grinned. "But you smiled." She shook her head, but she didn't deny it. One evening, after she closed up the cafe, she found Ethan waiting outside, leaning casually against his sleek black car. "You stalking me now?" she teased, but there was no real bite to her words. He chuckled. "I was in the neighborhood." She raised an eyebrow. "And that's supposed to be believable?" He gave her a sheepish smile. "Okay, fine, I may have planned this, but only because I had an idea." She crossed her arms. "Oh, come with me," he said, holding open the passenger door. Eva hesitated, getting into a car with a man she barely knew. It went against every instinct she had, but something in the way he looked at her, like he wasn't just trying to impress her, but genuinely wanted to share something with her, made her waver. "Where are we going?" "You'll see," he said mysteriously. Against her better judgment, she got in. 20 minutes later, they were standing on a rooftop overlooking the city. The skyline stretched before them, the buildings glowing under the night sky. The air was cool, crisp, and for the first time in a long while, Eva felt peaceful. Ethan stood beside her, watching her reaction instead of the view. "Worth the mystery?" She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Yeah, it is." They stood in silence for a moment before he spoke again. "You spend so much time taking care of others, Eva. When's the last time someone did something for you?" She frowned, caught off guard by the question. "I don't know," she admitted. "Probably never." Ethan exhaled, shaking his head. "That's not right." She turned to him. "Not everyone gets to have an easy life, Ethan." He met her gaze, something unreadable in his expression. "I know that, but you deserve more than just surviving." Something in her chest tightened. No one had ever said that to her before. Before she could respond, Ethan grinned and reached into his pocket. "I got you something." Eva blinked. What? He handed her a small, neatly wrapped box. She hesitated before taking it, untying the ribbon carefully. Inside was a simple silver bracelet, delicate but strong. She swallowed. "Ethan, I can't—" "It's not about the gift," he interrupted gently. "It's about the fact that you should have people who think of you too." Her fingers tightened around the box. She wanted to tell him that this was too much, that she couldn't afford to let herself believe in things like this. But then he smiled at her, really smiled, and for the first time in a long time, she wanted to believe. So instead of pushing him away, she simply whispered, "Thank you." And for that moment, she let herself enjoy the warmth of having someone who cared. Eva had always believed that the safest way to live was to keep her heart guarded. Life had taught her that nothing lasted forever, especially not love. But then Ethan Montgomery had walked into her world. He had turned her quiet, predictable, life into something uncertain, and she didn't know how to handle it. Days had passed since their conversation outside the café, the one where she had told him they couldn't be anything more. Since then, Ethan had stopped coming by every morning. First, Eva told herself it was a good thing. That distance was necessary, that she had done the right thing. But each morning that passed without seeing him sitting by the window, waiting with a quiet smile and his usual order, felt empty. She hated how much she missed him. One evening, Eva found herself pacing the small apartment, unable to focus. Ben, who had been watching her from the couch, finally sighed and put down his book. "Eva," he said, crossing his arms. "You're driving me crazy." She blinked. "What?" Ben rolled his eyes. "You keep sighing and pacing and acting like someone stole your favorite coffee mug." Eva frowned. "I do not." Ben just raised an eyebrow. She groaned, sinking into the couch beside him. "It's just Ethan." Ben smirked. "Oh, the guy you totally don't have feelings for." She shot him a look. Not helping. Ben leaned forward, his expression turning serious. "So what's the problem?" Eva sighed. "I told him we couldn't work, that we're too different. And now, I think I messed up." Ben studied her for a moment before speaking. "Eva, I get why you're scared, but you've spent your whole life pushing people away before they even get a chance to stay." She opened her mouth to argue, but he cut her off. "You're always looking for the worst-case scenario," he said. "But what if, just this once, you let yourself hope for the best?" Hope. It was such a simple word, but for Eva, it had always felt dangerous. The next day, she found herself standing outside Ethan's office building. She had no idea what she was doing there. She had spent all night convincing herself to forget him, to move on. And yet, here she was. Before she could change her mind, she stepped inside. The receptionist looked up. "Can I help you?" I'm here to see Ethan Montgomery. Do you have an appointment?" Eva hesitated. "No, but..." Before she could finish, a familiar voice interrupted. "Eva." She turned to see Ethan standing a few feet away, his expression a mixture of surprise and something else, something unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he sighed. "Come with me." He led her into his office, closing the door behind them. Eva swallowed hard. Ethan held up a hand. "Before you say anything, just tell me one thing." She nodded hesitantly. "Why are you here?" The question was simple, but the answer felt impossibly hard. She took a deep breath. "Because I think I made a mistake." Ethan studied her, his gaze searching. "Which part?" She met his eyes. "Pushing you away." For a long moment he didn't say anything. Then finally he let out a quiet laugh. "Do you have any idea how frustrating you are?" Eva blinked. "Excuse me." Ethan shook his head, smiling despite himself. "You fight so hard against happiness, Eva. You act like love is some kind of trap instead of something worth taking a chance on." Her chest tightened. "It's not that simple." Maybe it is, he said softly. Maybe love is just about letting yourself believe that someone won't leave. She hesitated. And what if they do? Ethan's expression softened. And what if they don't? Silence stretched between them. For the first time in a long time, Eva let herself imagine it. A life where she didn't have to be afraid of losing something good. A life where she let herself be happy. She took a shaky breath. I don't know how to do this, she admitted. Ethan smiled, stepping closer. Then let's figure it out together. And for the first time, Eva thought, maybe that was enough. Eva had always believed that love was a luxury, something reserved for people who didn't have to struggle just to make it through the day. She had convinced herself that she didn't need it, that she and Ethan were too different for their lives to ever fit together. But standing in his office that day, hearing his words, something inside her shifted, and it terrified her. For the next few weeks, Eva found herself in unfamiliar territory. She and Ethan weren't exactly together, but they weren't apart either. He had stopped pushing, giving her space to figure things out. But the thing was, she didn't want space. She wanted him. And yet, every time she thought about letting him in completely, her old fears crept back in. She had spent so long believing that love only led to pain, that if she let herself fall, she would lose everything. And she didn't know if she was strong enough to take that risk. One evening, Ethan showed up at the café just as her shift was ending. She was wiping down the counters when she heard his voice behind her. "Hey, stranger." She turned, surprised. "Ethan, what are you doing here?" He smiled. "Thought I'd walk you home." Eva hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." They walked in comfortable silence, the cool night air crisp against her skin. After a while, Ethan spoke. "Eva, I know you're scared." She stiffened slightly but didn't respond. He sighed. "But I need to know, are you ever going to stop running from this?" She stopped walking, her heart pounding. "Ethan, it's not that simple, isn't it?" He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "I know you have your reasons for keeping people at a distance, but at some point, you have to decide if you're going to let your past define your future." Eva swallowed hard. "And what if I make the wrong choice?" Ethan's voice softened. "Then I'll still be here, but you have to meet me halfway." Silence stretched between them. Eva felt like she was standing at the edge of something huge, something that could change everything. And for the first time, she wasn't sure if she wanted to walk away. She took a shaky breath. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. Ethan smiled gently. "Then let's figure it out together." And just like that, the walls she had built for so long started to crack. Maybe, just maybe, she was finally ready to let them fall. The city lights shimmered in the distance as Eva stood by the railing of the rooftop terrace. The evening breeze brushed against her skin, carrying with it the scent of rain that had fallen earlier. Below, the streets bustled with life. Cars, honking, people laughing, the world moving, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. For the first time in a long time, Eva wasn't running. She wasn't questioning, second-guessing, or doubting. She was here, and so was Ethan. She turned, watching as he approached, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. There was something different in his eyes tonight, something steady, unwavering. "You okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. Eva nodded. "Yeah, just thinking." Ethan leaned against the railing beside her, gazing out at the skyline. "Big thoughts," she exhaled, smiling softly. "Life-changing ones." A pause. Then, quietly, he asked, "And what have you decided?" Eva turned to face him fully. "That I don't want to be afraid anymore." Ethan held her gaze. "And what does that mean for us?" She took a step closer. "It means I choose you. I choose this. I don't know what the future holds, but I want to face it with you." A slow smile spread across Ethan's face, one of pure relief and happiness. "You have no idea how long I've waited to hear that." Eva laughed lightly. "Probably as long as I've been trying to convince myself that I didn't feel the same way." Ethan reached for her hands, intertwining their fingers. "No more convincing, no more running," she nodded. "No more running." And then, as if fate had been waiting for this exact moment, he leaned in and she met him halfway. The kiss was soft at first, hesitant, full of emotions unspoken, but as his arms wrapped around her, pulling her closer, it deepened into something more, something certain, something real. When they pulled apart, Ethan rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm against her skin. "I love you, Eva." A tear slipped down her cheek, but it wasn't from sadness. It was from the overwhelming realization that she had finally found what she never knew she was searching for. "I love you too, Ethan." And just like that, under the city lights, with the world still moving around them, their love was sealed, not by circumstance, not by chance, but by fate.